Well, we are still in our series looking at the New Testament book of James, which challenges us to have serious faith. Last week we heard about our words, that our words and even our internal monologues can actually create life or death. Next week is our last in this series, and then we will be in Lent, preparing for Easter. We're going to have a drive-through Ash Wednesday on February 17th from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. Carol and I will offer a blessing and place the ashes on your forehead or the palm or on your hand, on the back of your hand, from your car. Since we will be kind of up close to be able to do that, we'll be wearing masks, and we ask that you do as well. But this week we are still in James. In fact, we are getting to one of the main reasons that James wrote this letter. The church receiving this letter originally was riddled with internal conflicts. James tells us in our text today that the root of the problem was pretty simple. You want something and do not have it. You covet something and cannot obtain it. So you engage in disputes and conflicts. That's how he summarizes it. Different factions in the church wanted things their way. Different individuals within the church wanted things their way. Some wanted to just live however they wanted during the week and get a little spiritual pick-me-up on Sunday. And those factions, those individuals were responding to this conflict with personal attacks. James metaphorically calls their actions murder toward each other. In the face of this internal nuclear warfare among the supposed saints, James offers these words from chapter 4. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. You covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Adulterers, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you suppose that it is for nothing that the Scripture says God yearns jealously for the Spirit that He has made to dwell in us? But He gives all the more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, your joy into dejection. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor? This is the word of the Lord. So thanks be to God. I want to imagine with me. I want you to imagine with me. Go travel forward in time to when we can, easily have house guests again. That's difficult to imagine for some. For others, it might be easy to imagine. But go with me. Whether that's easy or difficult for you, go to the place where we can have house guests once again. And in this imaginary scenario, you're going to get to pick precisely one of the following house guests. You've only got two options. So let me share their profiles with you, and you decide which one you're going to invite over in this magical future time. House guest A is very proud of his 5-finger discounts. That's shoplifting, by the way. He loves coming over for dinner and then crashing at your house for a few extra weeks. Some people have left reviews of him that say he's so hard to get rid of, he's like a tick. Another person said about him, keep all your valuables locked away when he comes over. That's house guest A. Got it? All right, house guest B. This is your second choice. You only get two choices. This is your second choice. House guest B is known for doing all of the dishes for you before he goes home. The people who've left reviews have said, you spoke the most insightful words to me. Another one said, after this visit, I felt more at peace than at any other time in my life. That's house guest B. Which one do you want to invite over? Do you want the lying thief or the insightful dish doer? Which one are you going to invite over? Well, and James says in our text today, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. In the context of the conflict highlighted in this chapter from James, I would summarize it like this. Whenever we handle conflict with hostility in our hearts, we invite house guest A, the devil, into our hearts. When we approach conflict instead from a place of humility and grace in our hearts, we invite house guest B, God, into our hearts. So which house guest do you want to invite into your heart? Because hostility will pave the way for the devil. Grace and humility will pave the way for God. Which path will you pave? I tried to track down the source of this quote, but couldn't find it. But it stuck with me whenever I heard it the first time. So someone, somewhere, sometime said, the sword thrust in anger always pierces our own heart first. The sword we thrust in anger always pierces our own heart first. Now, some of you are thinking, there was a time when Jesus was angry, right? I even referenced it in a message recently about Jesus being angry when he overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. And yes, that is correct. Sometimes righteous anger is needed to correct incredible wrongs, but let's do some math. How many times was Jesus faced with conflict in the Bible? Many dozen, hundreds probably. The religious leaders were constantly testing him. But he didn't skewer them with his words. He calmly embarrassed them quite frequently, actually, but he didn't shout them down. His own followers frequently misunderstood Jesus, but he didn't berate them for their small minds and smaller hearts. Surely, if there was a time to be angry and to fight back, that would be at his arrest and an eventual crucifixion. That'd be a good time to fight back, right? But instead, he stopped his followers from fighting, healed the ear of the one person who was injured, and as the scripture says, like a lamb who before its shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. So out of dozens, maybe hundreds of conflicts in the Bible, Jesus had that one obvious moment of visible righteous anger that turned into action like that. And that one example, was very specific. It wasn't about fixing the political situation in Israel. That's what people wanted him to do. They were occupied by a foreign power, so the political situation was not good. That one example of righteous anger wasn't about fixing the taxes, which was a big deal at the time. People were killing each other over whether to pay Roman taxes. That one example of Jesus's righteous anger turning into action like that, that was when people were manipulating the faithful for their own gain as they came up to the temple to worship the living God. That's what got Jesus steaming mad. So yes, Jesus did have a display of righteous anger. He had won. I would have lost my cool way sooner than he did. And I believe that we tend to feel justified by our anger and by our actions from our anger drastically earlier than we should. So, to play it safe, since we are almost always wrong about our anger being justified or the actions we take from our anger being justified, since the sword that we thrust in anger always pierces our own heart first, I would err on the side of caution. Approach conflict with grace and humility rather than anger. Because with grace and humility, you are astronomically more likely to be paving the path for Jesus in your heart rather than paving the path for the devil in your heart. So in our conflicts, James encourages and challenges us to think about which house guest we are inviting over to stay. Are we paving the way for the devil in our hearts through anger and malice? Or are we paving the way for Jesus with grace and humility. I think James hints at least one important way that we can choose grace and humility, a tool we can use to help increase in that. Now, to get to that tool, and in honor of Super Bowl Sunday, we're going to consider two quarterbacks. I'm apparently in a multiple choice mood today. Just be glad that I'm not giving you essay tests here. Just one more multiple choice test here. One more choice. We're going to give you a choice between two different quarterbacks. Which one do you want for your team? One quarterback threw for 339 yards, completed 61% of his passes, had 2 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. That's a pretty good stat line for those at home. The other quarterback was worse in just about every single way. Threw for less yards, completed less of his passes, and threw 3 interceptions. That's not a great stat line if you're not a football fan. Now, the two choices here, the first quarterback, Drew Lock, quarterback of the Denver Broncos, in a losing effort against the Las Vegas Raiders in the last week of the season. The second quarterback with the worst stat line, that was Tom Brady, quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a winning effort in the NFC Championship game last week against the Green Bay Packers. Sorry, Packer fans, I know we got a contingent here to bring up that pain. If I just gave you the stats, though, you would want the good stat line. But if I gave you the choice between the Broncos season, which ended outside of the playoffs, or the Buccaneers, who are going to be appearing in the Super Bowl today, you're going to take their season, right? You're going to take the Buccaneers season, even though their quarterback, the last game their quarterback played, had a worse stat line. But I believe that we often complain to God because when we look at our lives, we see our stat lines and they're not what we would want. I believe we often blame God because the details of our lives are not what we would prefer. I believe we are often angry because we don't get things the way we want them when we want them. And I believe that's like looking at the stat line for the quarterbacks instead of looking at which team won and which team had a better season. That, according to James, was one of the problems in our text today, too. Getting stuck, getting fixated on your way. So that's the problem. What's the tool? What's the fix? Well, James says, submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Give the details, in other words, to God. Let God handle the implementation. God's stat line is almost never going to be what we would choose if we had a magic wand or a genie in a bottle. God's path is almost never the path that we would choose going forward at the beginning of the journey. But choosing our way, choosing our stat line, choosing our path means taking the losing season from Drew Lock instead of Tom Brady's Super Bowl appearance. God's ways are rarely what we would choose on our own, and yet they are better. So let God handle the details. That's one choice we can make, is to try to choose to let God handle the implementation, because our attachment and craving and demand for things to go just the way we want them, that leads us away from God. That's our will instead of God's. That's our way instead of God's highway. Last week, my younger son was very tired in the afternoon, and we had to do things a little differently than he preferred. And what does a 5-year-old do when he doesn't get his way, especially a tired one? Gets grumpy, right? That reaction, by the way, is not expressly limited to 5-year-olds. So I asked him to choose a different attitude and to be flexible, because we still had good things in store for him. And he told me, well, my attitude is my choice, and you can't tell me what to choose. He thought he had me on that one. Now, I tried not to laugh, though, because that was some serious sass, right? But then I told him, you're right. You can make that choice. But I can't make you choose your attitude, but I can tell you what the consequences will be for your choice of a grumpy attitude. And trust me, it's not going to be as fun. You need to think about that for a couple minutes. When we choose to be flexible to God's way instead of our preferences, we get to enjoy God's surprises. When we choose to be angry and combative when we don't get our way, we lose out on what different blessing God has in store for us. So the first tool, the first fix, according to James, is to choose to be flexible instead of being attached to our preferred plan. It takes quite a bit of humility to say God knows better than I do. And it's not always fun. But that kind of humility and that kind of flexibility opens our hearts to God's different blessing. Now, when I counsel couples prior to their weddings, I often tell them about a strange paradox in handling conflict. When we're worked up and we want to state our case as forcefully as we can, when we won't take no for an answer, we tend to frame it as a demand. And I usually try to make it trivial and funny by saying, you will pick up your socks and put them in the hamper every time, or so help me. But the paradox is that actually makes it less likely to get our spouse to do what we want if we frame it in that demand in combative way. Because whenever you make a demand like that, whenever you're combative like that, it actually kicks off a natural resistance within most people. It makes people want to say no just because of the way it was framed as a demand. If you reframe that as a request for help, on the other hand, you're actually more likely to arrive at or near the result you want, because most humans naturally want to help when asked nicely. So you're going with human nature when you frame it that way instead of against it. For example, you could say, my mind feels cluttered when our bedroom is cluttered. Could you please put your socks in the hamper before you go to bed at night? I would really appreciate it. Asking for help nicely goes with human nature instead of against it. Another way to improve your approach to conflict is actually by catching someone doing something close to correct instead of always highlighting where they failed. I've shared this tool before, but it bears repeating. If you constantly tell someone, or going with this premarital example, if you constantly tell your spouse, you didn't put your socks away, again, it's the third time this week, I hate that. That just generates more conflict. If instead you notice when they do put the socks away and thank them, that generates extra peace in your relationship. And as most business owners know, what gets rewarded gets repeated. James says in our text today, do not speak evil against one another. The more we point out the negative, the more we cultivate the negative in our relationships. The more we point out the positive, the more we cultivate the positive in our relationships. That's the second tool. A third tool in our spiritual toolbox for this is prayer. We can pray in different ways. James says you do not have because you do not ask. Have you prayed for a change in a conflict? Or have you just assumed it's impossible? And we can pray, James says, for God's grace. James says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. So pray to God to give you his eyes. Pray to God to give you his heart. Pray to God to give you his grace. Now, I know it's more fun to pray for God's divine retribution on your enemies, but have you tried praying for God's eyes and heart and grace? That kind of prayer paves the way for Jesus in your heart. I also want to remind everyone of the key principle of conflict that Jesus covered. I'm not going to dwell on it. It's not in our text today, but since we're talking about conflict, Christ-like conflict, remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out the fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. In other words, handle conflict in person. Handle conflict one-on-one whenever you can. Handle conflict directly. But that's not usually how we go about things, right? No, we tend to handle conflict indirectly. We tend to handle conflict by, I'll talk to a couple of these people instead of the actual person involved. In the church, I know people may complain to one person, hoping that they will send it along to the right person so that they don't have to handle it directly. But that's not how Jesus told us to handle conflict. Handle it directly, one-on-one first. That almost always results in less problems and more resolution. I actually told someone just last week that the only thing in the universe that can travel faster than the speed of light is a rumor. If we do not handle it directly, we create more problems. So, sisters and brothers, conflict is one area where I would guess that most of us, even most of the time, are not very Christ-like by default, not very Christ-like in our conflict by default. This has been a problem since the very first churches. Otherwise, we would not have the book of James in the Bible. But when we approach conflict from anger and hostility, that paves the way in our hearts for the devil. Approaching conflict from a place of grace and humility, that paves the way in our hearts for Jesus. Now, if you want to, ooch a little closer to being Christ-like in conflict, there are several tools we talked about today. You can choose to be flexible with the details instead of getting fixated on your preferred implementation. You can ask for help instead of making demands of other people. You can notice when someone does something, approximately right, instead of just catching them when they're wrong. You can pray. You can pray for resolution of the conflict. You can pray for God's grace in your heart. You can pray for the other people in the conflict. But also in all of this, remember to follow Jesus' command to handle conflict directly, in person, one-on-one first. So pick one of those tools. Give it a try. You'll be paving the way in your heart for Jesus this week. Amen.